Coming up on Philosophy Talk.
Where could we use experiments in philosophy?
Here's an example.
There's an out-of-control trolley coming, and it's going to run over those 5 unsuspecting children.
But if I throw the switch, it'll only run over that one unsuspecting hefty guy. What would you do? How do you know what you would do? Experimental philosophy says, look and see.
Ken, there's an out-of-control trolley coming down this track. There's no switch. There's 5 children in the way. What are we going to do?
Well, look at the hefty guy over there. If we pick him up and throw him in the way, he'll stop the train.
Did Ken make the right decision in throwing the hefty guy in front of the train? What would you do?
Our guest is well-known philosopher Anthony Appiah, who's written a book about experiments in ethics.
Out of the armchair, into the lab. Experimental philosophy.
Coming up on Philosophy Talk after the news. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. We're coming to you from the studios of KALW in San Francisco.
Continuing conversations that began at Philosopher's Corner on the Stanford campus.
Today, experimental philosophy.
Oh, come on, Ken. Experimental philosophy? That's an oxymoron. Philosophy is sitting in an armchair and thinking straight about difficult problems. Armchairs, not labs. If I'd wanted to work in a lab, I would have become a physicist or a chemist.
Yeah, no, that's a long-standing conception of philosophy. But, there's a hot new movement afoot that takes the experimental method, true, borrowed from the sciences, and imports it right into the heart of philosophy.
Yeah, hot new method. That means young philosophers are trying to screw up my life and get me out of my comfortable armchair to do something else. I'm with the old dead guys like Descartes. You want to know about philosophy? You do thought experiments. Could I imagine not having a body? Sure. Can I imagine not having a mind? Ain't so easy. Then let's think about the results of that thought experiment.
Yeah, right. And the Descartes concluded, so the mind is separate from the body. That's really a firm, repeatable result. But, that's old hat.
Well,
experiments.
They didn't have very good armchairs back then.
Right. That's old hat, thought experiments. But real experiments, that's revolutionary, and it's changing the face of philosophy.
Well, I mean, what kind of experiments are we talking about? So maybe I would type up Pythagoras' theorem and put it in a Petri dish and see what happens?
Nothing quite that crude and undoable, John, but think about, say, the concept of right and wrong. How you're going to sit in your armchair, you're going to try to figure out what's right, what's wrong, and how are you going to do it? You're going to sit there, you're going to think of different scenarios, you're going to say, I approve that one, don't approve that one, you alone in your armchair. But why should anybody believe that? Gather a bunch of subjects, put them in different scenarios, describe different situations, vary it systematically, see how they respond, do some analysis of their response, just like in psychology or any other experimental discipline. That's how you do it. That's how you figure out the concept of right and wrong.
Well, I admit it might be somewhat interesting to have, say, your graduate students go out and ask a bunch of ordinary folk about their feelings about right and wrong in various situations, but it's a category mistake to think that's philosophy. Philosophy is not thinking about how people do describe things, but how they ought to describe things.
Well, you're making an important point, this distinction between what is and what ought to be, and some philosophers actually do reject experimental philosophy because they think they run those two different things together or conflate them. Questions about what ought to be and what is, and philosophy is about the ought to be's. So some people agree with you about that.
Well, I'm trying to get my head around this. And I can see, take an alien culture, like, say, Stanford undergraduates. Suppose I want to philosophize about their norms. I'd first have to figure out what their norms are. And I can't do that in an armchair because it's a total alien culture. Still, it seems to make sense to have experiments to figure out what the norms are. But then there's the question, are these norms rational?
Well, yeah. So, John, you're getting the hang of it. Look, even for these normative questions, we can figure, what norms do they live by? We can do that experimentally. We have to do it experimentally. And so you're getting the hang of this. And, our guest, Anthony Appiah, is an expert on this stuff. He's going to join us on a bit. We'll have a really practiced guy helping us think about this.
Anthony Appiah. Anthony's back at Princeton. Princeton is one of these ivy-covered places with beautiful offices and wonderful armchairs. Now, I'm And I'm going to ask Anthony, why in the world would he give up that beautiful armchair to go into some smelly philosophy lab?
Right, and once we ask him that, he say, what's the result when you get in that smelly philosophy lab? What startling things do you discover by importing the experimental method into philosophy?
Finally, we'll take a closer look at what experimental philosophy has to teach us or obscure for us about the boundary between philosophy and science.
But before we talk to that seasoned experimental philosopher Anthony Appiah, our own roving philosophical reporter Zoe Corneli tries her hand at gauging real people's reactions to an ethical dilemma. She files this report.
First, a disclaimer. I'm not a philosopher or a scientist, so what you're about to hear is, by definition, a hack job. But that doesn't mean it's not fun. And fortunately, Philosophy Talk's own Director of Research, Daniel Elstein, was kind enough to bring me to a hotbed of philosophical thinking.
We're outside the Philosophy Corner on Stanford campus.
So what better place to find some sharp young minds to test out these ethical decision-making situations on, right?
Agreed.
I've come prepared with the famous ethical thought experiment known as the trolley problem. You see a trolley headed towards 5 innocent children tied to the tracks, but you can switch the trolley to another track where it will only run over one man. What would you do?
I would probably save the children because there are more of them, and so I'm saving 4 lives.
My initial response intellectually is to think about evolutionary theory, right? And how these children, if they're going to be able to successfully promote the human species, then it would be worse to kill them because of the potential that would be lost there.
Children have more to their lives to experience as opposed to this one man, and the fact that there's 5 children versus this one man. If I had to do something like that, I would probably flip the switch, I think.
So, there appears to be more or less a consensus that flipping the switch is the right thing to do. But what if we complicate the problem just a little bit? Same track, same trolley, same 5 children. But now, instead of sitting near the tracks, you're actually on a bridge over the tracks, and instead of flipping a switch, you can still save the children, but this time it's because there's a large, heavy man sitting next to you on the bridge, and you could push him onto the tracks, where he would get killed and his body weight would stop the train from running over the children. Now, what would you do in that scenario?
I'm not sure what I would do. I guess, based on my previous logic, I should, but the act of having to push him off makes it a little bit more difficult. There's definitely a difference, but I'm not sure how I would describe it. I don't know. I'm having a difficult time with this.
As far as the math goes, there's no difference. But the experience of getting to that math, I think there's a huge difference. And really, I honestly think that I might just be debilitated in the second scenario. Debilitated by looking at both options and just my eyes glancing back and forth and back and forth.
The actual physical act of pushing him sort of involves me a lot more emotionally. That would just, I think it would be a lot harder for me to cope with as a person after the fact, to push him, and it seems a lot more murderous than the other situation, I guess.
Well, if the children are just as innocent as the man, they just happen to be on the tracks and the man doesn't, then it seems like pushing the man off is the right thing to do, but I think I couldn't bring myself to actually physically do the act.
So everyone agrees the idea of actively killing the man feels different from indirectly killing him by flipping the switch, even though the result is exactly the same. I asked Director of Research Daniel Elstein if he had any idea why the second trolley scenario seems different.
Well, I'm not sure. I think it might just be a practical concern with causing harm, so you don't feel like you're directly causing harm in the first case where you just flip the switch. But if you're pushing someone in front of a train, I think it's just, practically speaking, it's better to avoid causing harm because you never know what harm you're capable of if you allow yourself to justify causing harm.
For Philosophy Talk, I'm Zoe Corneli.
I'm John Perry. With me is Ken Taylor.
And our guest today is Anthony Appiah. He's professor of philosophy from Princeton University. He's author, most recently, of Experiments in Ethics. Anthony, welcome back to Philosophy Talk.
It's very good to be with you.
Anthony, you were trained just like me and as an a priori armchair philosopher, thinking about language, conditionals, and so forth. Then you went on to transcend that, become a public intellectual, thinking about things that people actually care about, but still, I think, largely in an armchair. Why in the world did you leave that comfortable armchair and write a book about experimental philosophy?
Well, the main thing I want to say in answer to that question is that the book was written in an armchair, and I didn't do any experiments. Like a lot of philosophical reflection on experiments, I was thinking about other people's experiments, and that's a fairly standard activity for people even with our kind of a priori training.
Well, that's a relief. I just hated to think of you out there, in a smelly philosophy lab. But okay, so now that you're kind of a meta-experimental philosopher, so why should we or other people do experiments in philosophy at all? I mean, why isn't it just an a priori normative thing that should be conducted in an? I mean, who cares? I mean, should Descartes care about what a bunch of French peasants think about the mind and the body?
Probably not very much. But I think that these questions that are being investigated in experimental ethics, the most challenging of them are relevant to what we do in the armchair because they suggest hypotheses about what's going on in us when we're sitting in our armchair thinking about these questions. And if you're going to rely on intuitions about cases and somebody has an account of your intuitions that makes them unreliable, that's something that you ought to worry about. So when people do these experiments which suggest, for example, that our response to those trolley cases is largely a matter of how emotional we feel about various options, the difference between flipping the switch and pushing the man off the bridge and so on, that makes you think, well, in the first place, it makes you think, well, maybe this is not a very good way to decide what to do, the relying on intuitions, if that's what's guiding them.
Wait, let me stop you. So I don't know about relying on intuitions. I'm not quite sure what you're getting at there. So you mean these trolley problems. I give you this scenario. Fortunately or unfortunately, the Human Subjects Committee would not let you actually run a trolley experiment, right?
That's
In
right.
most universities, they have these committees, and you're conducting experiments. They say, how are you treating the human subjects? And it would not let you treat human subjects this way.
Absolutely.
Right. But so what are you talking about relying? So we've got this hypothetical, and we're not actually forced to do the thing, but we kind of think, what would I do? Is that what you're talking about?
Well,
you think we're not very good at judging what we would do in those situations?
Well, actually, I mean, when you do these experiments, it's very important what you actually ask and how you actually ask it, because it turns out to make a big difference. So when the first person to do these experiments while looking at people's brains, who is a man called Josh Green, didn't actually ask them what they would do. He asked them what it would be right to do. So they weren't thinking about, they weren't asked to think about doing it themselves. And he was indeed, as you suggest, testing people's intuitions about what's right, and that's a standard thing for philosophers to do. We give people examples, hypothetical examples, and we ask what they think about them. But in this case, what Josh Green did was to show, according to him anyway, that if you looked at what was going on in people's brains when they thought about what was right, they were inclined to answer that they shouldn't push the fat man off the bridge, just in case they were sort of emotionally, the emotional bits of the brain were active. And that suggested that what they were responding to wasn't a thought about what they should do, but what they were responding to was the thought about, or what anyone should do, was the thought about how it would feel to do it.
Well, some of our undergraduates in Zoe Cornelius' piece said something very much like that. It's just too emotional to actually push the guy. And so you're suggesting that experimental philosophy is showing us that there's something deep about that. I mean, there's a deep insight in there, because the brain is actually reasoning differently about these situations depending on how they're described.
Yes, I think that is the right conclusion to draw, and then we have to go, that's the first level conclusion. Then, as John said, we have to go back to the armchair and think about what that might mean. And there are two, as you can expect, being philosophers, there are two possible responses which are sort of opposite. One response is to take this as a debunking of our intuitions, to say this just shows that we're emotional and we should be reasoning about these things. The other is is to say, no, what this shows is that our emotions are guiding us to a good answer.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. Today we're discussing a hot new movement called experimental philosophy with Anthony Appiah from Princeton University.
Experimental philosophy has gotten a lot of press. It's been written up in the New York Times, but has it produced any results? Have we learned anything? Is it just a fad driven by science envy, or is it a deep new way of making philosophical progress? Share your hypothesis, philosophical or scientific, by calling 1-800-525-9917. That's 1-800-525-9917.
Experimental philosophy, revolution or passing fad, plus your calls and emails when Philosophy Talk continues.
He threw on the railroad track, and then that train started coming, and then along came John.
In the famous trolley experiment in philosophy, unsuspecting children are rescued from an oncoming train, either by throwing a switch or by pushing a fat man onto the trolley track before it gets to the children. That's a thought experiment. What should we do about it in the new age of experimental philosophy? Should we just sit in an armchair and think about what's right and wrong, or should we ask a lot of non-philosophers what they think is right and wrong, or what they would do? Is philosophy kind of a priori theoretical thing, or is it somehow empirical? And if it's empirical, how does philosophy differ from science? I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. The new movement toward experimental philosophy is our subject. We'd love to know what you think. The toll-free number, 1-800-525-9917. That's 1-800-525-9917. Or, as always, you can email us at comments@philosophytalk.org.
Our guest is Anthony Appiah, author of Experiments in Ethics.
So, Anthony, in this segment, we want to dig into some of these results of the experimental philosophy movement and some of the main experiments. But why don't you tell us something startling that research in experimental philosophy has shown? I mean, what would startle me and say, I really should take this very seriously?
People are 10 times as likely to give you change for $1 outside a bakery with the smell of fresh bread as outside a dry goods store.
Wow. Yeah,
now
boy.
that's startling.
Yeah.
So, wait a minute. I think people would give you, so here I change, what was that now? Change for $1?
Well, actually,
Or
any moderately helpful act is much more likely when people can smell croissants than when they can't.
Wait a minute.
That, of course, is relevant to an old question in philosophy about the role of, as it were, character in explaining people's behavior and their moral dispositions. If it turns out that we're the creatures of circumstances in that sort of way, then maybe character isn't so important.
Wait, so there are good guys and there are not so good guys in the world, right? The good guys do the right thing in all kinds of different circumstances, right? Because they're virtuous. They've got good character. Be a person of outstanding character, and you'll do the right thing in many different circumstances. Are you telling me, it sounds like you're telling me, that somehow experimental philosophy has shown that there aren't good guys versus bad guys?
Well, I should say these experiments weren't done by experimental philosophers, and this requires us to make a distinction between two ways in which you might speak of experimental philosophy, in ethics anyway. One is philosophers drawing on these sorts of experimental results to answer philosophical questions. The other is philosophers actually doing the experiments themselves.
Yeah.
I think most people would say that philosophers have thought about other people's experiments,
right.
all along. So the new thing is the philosopher being involved in the experiment. And again, there are sort of two different lines of research. One is just canvassing people's intuitions, only doing it on a larger scale than just going to a philosophy conference and asking a few of your buddies. And the other is looking at people's brains while they're thinking about such problems, which involves the collaboration of psychologists and other such people, because you're not allowed to look at people's brains if you're a philosopher without the requisite training.
So Anthony, let's go back to this experiment, though, before we get into looking at brains.
Sure.
So this is from, I guess, what's called attribution psychology.
Right.
Now, I must admit, I kind of believe in character traits, but
yes.
I wouldn't think that a helpful person would give me change for $1 in any circumstance. I mean, if I stop them while they're running to catch a train, or come up to them at their mother's funeral and say, "Hey, you got change for a dollar," I wouldn't. But I would expect, that there are these people who are helpful, and they'll be more likely than unhelpful people to give you change for a dollar outside a bakery, and they'll also be more unlikely than unhelpful people to give you change for a dollar outside of a dry cleaner's, even though they may be less likely outside of a dry cleaner's than outside of a bakery. So does this kind of experiment really show that there aren't character traits?
No. I think, again, you can't draw any conclusion of that very powerful sort from any experiment, however, or any sequence of experiments. You've got to think about them. And what you just said is a natural first response to someone who thinks that
high praise,
who thinks that this shows something important about character. What I think this experiment and many like it suggest isn't so much that people don't have different dispositions. It's that we may have got the wrong ways of categorizing what the dispositions are, and that we're much more sensitive to features of our environment than we normally suppose.
Let me slow this down just a little bit, because just to make clear what some people take to be the punchline of the kind of experiment you're talking about. Some people think, and have claimed, and some experimental philosophers have claimed, that these experiments about when people will help you out. Well, here's two things. First, we try to explain people's behavior to ourselves in terms of their character traits. We think character traits are enduring things, right? They're kind of global dispositions that, given the situation, it's the character traits that determine how people behave. Mm-hmm. Some people think these experiments show, no, there are no such things as character traits, and that our attempt to explain people in terms of character traits really misses the mark, and we really need to rethink the whole way we think about how people behave and what controls their behavior. Mm-hmm. And you're saying that's a great overreaction, right?
I think the second thing is a massive overreaction. For one thing, lots of the very same people who do these experiments do other experiments which establish that people do have enduring traits. So you can't pick and choose. You've got to take everything they give us for these experiments, and the experiments suggest, in other sorts of experiments, suggest that we do have certain relatively stable dispositions. But I think what this does suggest is that our normal folk understanding of helpfulness is not quite right. That we think that the main explanation for why people are helpful and unhelpful is helpfulness, and that, of course, there are things like being in a hurry or being at your mother's funeral that not only stop you doing the helpful thing, but make it legitimate for you not to do the helpful thing.
So now let's get the brain back in here. So now I'm a philosopher, and I realize, I've got to look at these experiments. Maybe I don't have to actually do any, but I should read about the experiments that attributionists do and that other philosophers do. And now you're saying a second thing might be useful to me, looking at brains, or at least what do we do with brains? We see what parts of brains light up when people are given various tasks. How's that going to be helpful to me?
Well, there's a very old question in moral psychology, as philosophers do it, which is how we should think of the balance between reason and emotion, for example, reason and the passions, to use older language, and their relative importance and their role in moral life. So if psychologists tell us that they can identify the parts of the brain that are characteristically involved in paradigmatic reasoning tasks, and they can identify other parts of the brain that are characteristically involved when our passions are aroused, and if, when people are thinking about these questions, we see that some of the questions they're thinking about, the areas of the brain that are most active are the ones associated with reason, and with others, it's the areas of the brain most associated with the passions, then we have a piece of evidence in support of the view that the passions are playing a role, at least sometimes, evidence more substantial than just the intuition that this is so.
What would it be like to know that the reason is the slave of the passions? Can we do that by watching brains light up?
That's a complicated one, but let's let some of our callers in here. 1-800-525-9917. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're talking about experimental philosophy, and Philip in San Francisco is on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Philip.
Hi, thank you. Okay, I was thinking of that. I've heard this training thing before, and I love it. And I was wondering, have you guys ever thought about adding a third option, that option being throw yourself on the track?
The reason it has to be a fat man is that he has to be heavier than you, so that you're throwing yourself on the track isn't an option. So the people who designed the original thought experiment explicitly wanted to exclude the thought that it would be helpful to throw yourself on the track. But of course, you could set up other hypothetical examples, and in other hypothetical examples, you can ask people whether they'd be willing to throw themselves on the track to stop a trolley that was going to kill 5 kids.
Or you could just ask some fat people.
Okay, what if you had someone who was heavier than you? Okay, how about this option? Someone who's heavier than you, but a beautiful woman. A beautiful woman who you may be attracted to, but you don't know her.
So you're getting, Philip, you're getting into the frame of mind here, Philip. Well, you can get a grant, and you can perform all these different variations of the.
Just let me say that when people ask me, whether people have thought of these various other options, sometimes they have, sometimes they haven't. But if you want to look in the literature, you'll find that they have thought about literally scores and sometimes hundreds of different variations. And part of what's interesting about them is that very subtle changes in the description of the circumstance can make a difference to how people tend to answer it. Just one of the important things about these intuitions about trolley cases is that they're not 100%. When you ask a sample of people about these things, you get 80% will give the standard answer with each case. But 20%, give a different answer, and that I think shows that one of the important things in this area, which is that our intuitions about these things are not solid, clear, and stable.
Right, and it shows that there's a lot more to explain than we think when we just sit in our armchair, because we got to explain the variations.
Exactly.
Among the cases and among the subjects to the cases. So there's a lot more data.
There's a lot more to explain, and that goes back to a question that's absolutely, again, central to mainstream analytic post-Second World War philosophy of the English-speaking world, because people in that tradition, for example, Austin in Oxford and Wittgenstein in Cambridge and so on, both talked about what a competent person who understood the language should say in various circumstances. What these sorts of experiments tend to show, the ones done by philosophers asking people their intuitions about cases, is that actually competent speakers of the language don't 100% agree in many of these cases, and that therefore we have to have a more complicated understanding of what it is to be competent.
Right. Philip, thanks for the call. Ted in San Francisco is on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Ted.
Hi, thanks. I actually had 2 questions. One is, whenever I hear this thought experiment, I'm always wondering if it's supposed to reflect the reality of what people would actually do, because it seems kind of backwards in that you're given these 2 final options, but the reality is, when you're in that moment, you're thinking of a million options, and I think people, would either try and get down there and get the kids off the track, or start screaming at the train conductor or something like that. And so, I always wonder how much it's supposed to reflect the reality of what people would actually do. And the other thing is I was wondering what is supposed to be the difference between experimental philosophy and psychological experiments.
Well, those are good questions. I mean, when I think about the trolley case, I always start thinking, well, what if I push the fat man off and miss the tracks? Then I'm going to go to jail for murder. The 5 kids are going to be dead. It's very hard to keep your mind focused on the question. What do you think, Anthony?
Well, the key sort of question of method here is what's the connection between what people say about these hypotheses and what they'd actually do? And I think that's a very important question, and it goes to the issue of how important these sorts of cases are in understanding our moral life. As you said, Ted, in real cases, reality doesn't present you with a matrix with 2 options and their costs. Reality has to be interpreted. You have to look at the situation. You have to see whether there's somebody driving the trolley. You have to figure out what the best way is. And then you have to decide what the morally relevant features of the situation are. And all that is just given to you in these sorts of cases. And so they aren't very like real life. And some philosophers have objected to these sorts of examples on just those grounds.
But, there is a deep problem, which I don't know how to deal with. How are you going to determine what the moral, as it were, facts of the matter are? We have all these intuitions. Because, one of the things, I don't know if this stuff has been done cross-culturally, right? One of the things you might want to investigate is cross-cultural variation. in responses to this? No.
There is. I don't know. I bet somebody has done cross-cultural trolley tests, but I don't know what they found. But I do know that people have done comparisons with the students, I think, in Hong Kong and in New Jersey, and one of the striking differences, and again, it's a statistical difference. It's not 100% in one case and 100% in the other, is that in these sorts of cases, people in East Asia are less likely to feel it's appropriate to intervene at all. So they're less likely to flip the switch in the first case. They're also much more likely, on the other hand, to think that what matters is in other cases, what matters is the outcome, and so they're willing, for example, to see someone, an innocent person, hanged if it's going to save a community from riot and mayhem, which many people in the West are rather reluctant to do.
Anthony, a lot of these things, if you tried to make them too realistic, you'd run into human subjects problems.
Yes.
But there is another way. There's so much ability now to deal with virtual reality and have avatars, and even have your avatar, that is your representation of yourself on the screen, have certain different personality and character traits than you. Have experimental philosophers tried to assemble data about these things using the resources of virtual reality?
Again, when people ask me about what experiments have been done, I'm never going to say that they haven't been done just because I don't know about them. People are doing new experiments all the time. I think that would be a very important extension of these sorts of experiments would be to give people situations where they have to make choices in a virtual context where they know that the effects are in some sense not real, but still asking them to behave as they think they should behave and seeing what they would do.
Look, it's all very complicated. I suppose I could do all the experiments imaginable. I still wonder two things. Are we conflating philosophy with psychology in one way? You might think a cognitive psychologist who wants to investigate moral reasoning would do this same stuff. What's the difference between what the cognitive psychologist is looking for in the philosopher? Well, one of the things is the philosopher wants to know what the true theory of morality is. And I wonder if this is helping us get at that at all. I just wonder.
Well,
I'm going to put that question up there. Maybe we can dig into it in the next segment. You know what I mean, Anthony?
Okay.
Okay. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're discussing experimental philosophy with Anthony Appiah from Princeton University.
We've been talking about the achievements of experimental philosophy. In our next segment, we're going to look at what the successes and failures of experimental philosophy teach us, or should teach us, about the nature of the philosophical enterprise and the differences and similarities between things like experimental psychology. Really, how does philosophy differ from psychology or the rest of the sciences if philosophers are supposed to do experiments?
Boundary questions, plus more of your calls and emails when Philosophy Talk continues.
Give a little whistle, and always let your conscience be your guide. And always let your conscience be your guide.
And always let your conscience be your guide.
Questions of conscience, questions of right and wrong. These things have vexed philosophers for ages. Maybe experimental philosophy is going to explain all of this and provide us with the answers. I'm John Perry. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything
except your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor, and our guest is Anthony Appiah from Princeton University.
So, Anthony, let's follow up on Ken's question. If experimentalists are right, doesn't it follow that there really isn't any intrinsic difference between philosophy and the sciences, in particular psychology and cognitive science? Does philosophy then just become a branch of science? Can we get money from the NSF? What's going on here?
I think the temptation to apply for grants from the NSF is surely part of what's motivating experimental philosophy. But look, I don't think that we can give answers about any discipline that explain what it is in terms of some simple set of methods or questions or anything else. Disciplines are historical things. They grow and they develop, and what makes something a philosophical question today is, roughly speaking, that it grows out of the questions philosophers were asking yesterday. And that just takes us back to the beginning, to the questions that the Platos and the Aristotles and the Socrates were asking. And the questions have changed over time, but they grow out of this long historical conversation. Now, I think Ken pointed to one of the important differences when he asked the question before the break. One of the important differences is that the experimental psychologists are not interested. I mean, they may be interested as amateurs, but as professionals, they're not interested in the question what the right theory of morality is. That remains, I think, a distinctive interest of the philosopher, the moral philosopher, and though it happens that the work on functional magnetic resonance imaging of the brain and trolley problems was begun by a philosopher taking his questions to the psychologists, the psychologists have now run with these questions, and they are interested and they use trolley problems and all kinds of other diagnostic devices in order to follow the questions that they're interested in. But we have this other interest. We are interested in these things to the extent that, and because we think they'll help us make sense of the moral questions.
But I like reconciliation, and I'm a kind of touchy-feely guy. Like everybody to have their due and have their say and unite everything. So here's a kind of synthesis of all this. So we really do need to know what the true kind of moral psychology is, independently of the true moral theory. How people actually think and reason about matters of morality. We need to know that. We can't know that through sheer speculation. Right, so I think there's a big, moral psychologists, some may live in philosophy departments, some may live in psychology departments. But then the moral theorist has to take all that somehow and integrate it into the true account of morality. And that's a different question, but they got to be integrated. How's that for a reconciliation?
I think that's the right reconciliation, including the part that says that some of these people who are looking at the same questions may be in different departments. Josh Green, who did these experiments when he was a graduate student at Princeton, has a philosophy PhD, and he's now in the psychology department at Harvard. He's interested in the same questions, but he's moved offices.
We've got a few callers on the line. Peter in Charleston, Illinois. Well, welcome to Philosophy Talk, Peter.
Hi.
You must be listening to us online.
Yes. I was wondering what the future of experimental philosophy is, because I always hear about these same experiments over and over again. So what's the next step?
Well, the literature on we haven't mentioned, obviously, lots of questions. There's a whole interesting experimental psychology literature on the concept of intention and how we ascribe intentions to people, and that literature is fairly barreling along, and new experiments and new interpretations are coming all the time. I don't know the latest ones. And those experiments are experiments that you probably haven't heard about unless you actually work in the field. So I think there is a sort of bubbling along of lots and lots of people, many of them younger people, many of them graduate students, doing these sorts of things at all kinds of places, looking at all kinds of questions, and taking this material and returning with it to their armchairs to try and address the philosophical question that motivated them in the first place.
I should point out, I don't know with how much enthusiasm, but that in linguistics, there's over the last 10, 15, 20 years, there's been an enormous increase in the amount of research that's done on these huge corpuses of human conversations. That's become possible because of the analytical tools computers provide. And I think philosophers of language, particularly people involved in pragmatics and the use of language, are going to have to get into that or have the opportunity to get into it, to put it a little more enthusiastically.
Right, and again, it's not just philosophers doing experiments, although, like we were saying, there's a breed of young new philosophers who are thinking of themselves as experimentalists. But also, it's a new thing in philosophy, a new attitude, not that new, because 20-some-year-old attitude toward experimentation of other people. There's a ton of work in cognitive psychology and the cognitive science, developmental psychology, a ton of work, experimental work that's deeply philosophically relevant.
Exactly.
And philosophers are more and more trying to integrate that into what they do.
Absolutely. I think if you go back again, what's odd about the resistance to this is that in the heyday of analytic philosophy, one of the most significant sets of arguments were the arguments that Quine made against the idea of the analytic. And Quine, a paradigm analytical philosopher, argued that we should see, for example, epistemology as a branch of a sort of normative branch of psychology.
That's the study of knowledge, folks. Right.
And he thought he did this because he thought that he agreed with the claim that philosophy was conceptual analysis, but he thought that you couldn't do conceptual analysis in a purely a priori way.
Right.
And I think that's what these people are doing now is really only kind of carrying out that thought in a slightly wider range of fields than in the core cognitive sciences and linguistics, where it's been going on, as you both said, for quite a while. And if I can just say, This seems to me quite consistent with the long history of what we call philosophy as well. The expression experimental philosophy was around, after all, in the 18th century, in the 17th century already in English. And while, of course, it meant physics, roughly speaking, at that point, the thought was that experiments were relevant to these questions that people had been thinking about for a long time, often people who were thought of as philosophers.
Well, I think Hume subtitles his treatise, a work in experimental philosophy.
He does.
But as far as I know, the only experiment is when he has you poke yourself in the eye and notice that you see two things and concludes the external world doesn't exist.
Let's get the one last caller in here. John in San Rafael. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, John.
Hi. I was wondering if anybody in this question has considered the area of behavioral science called ethology, and more precisely neuroethology and primate ethology and anthropoid ethology. People I'm thinking of who've written in this area are Robert Sapolsky, Jared Diamond, and certainly Ed Wilson, sociobiology. This whole question of is somebody going to push the fat guy off the bridge is kind of a complacent question. It's really not looking at the broader evolutionary biology considerations. And I don't know, can you comment?
Yeah, we can comment. Thanks for the call.
We can comment on that, certainly. Well, one of the things I discuss in my book, and since my publisher won't forgive me if I don't remind you that I wrote a book about some of this, one of the things that I talk about in the book is the relevance of a huge amount of work in evolutionary psychology to precisely these questions of the evolution of moral psychology and the evolution of the moral emotions, and moving beyond the biological evolution to attempts to study the cultural development of our moral psychology. And so people in neuroeconomics do experiments which look at the ways in which people punish people who breach norms, even though it doesn't advantage them to do so. And they see that as evidence that we have developed these capacities because it's important for social creatures like us to be able to enforce norms.
Right. I mean, Anthony, we could do a whole show, as you know, and you could be our guest. We could do a whole show on evolutionary approaches to ethics as well. I mean, it's definitely an important and deep thing. And I just want to add, I mean, one of the things that, not so much experimental philosophy, but what we might call a naturalistic movement in philosophy, of which the experimental philosophy is kind of a late expression, thinks is that all these human capacities for reasoning about norms and all that come out of stuff, the substrate of which is already present in animals, and evolution somehow complexifies it. And if we look at, the great chain of being, we'll find chimps having some of this stuff, right? And then we'll find that human beings have some capacity to ratchet it up and change it. So that's it's not at all complacent into our...
No. In fact... the lab where Josh Green now works, Mark Hauser's lab, and Mark is an experimental psychologist. He's done a great deal of work on on primate behavior and on reciprocity in marmoset monkeys and things like that. So there's a lot of relevant work on our primate cousins and the ways in which their behavior reflects the needs of sociability, which are obviously a central part of what the evolutionary relevance is of our moral dispositions. We have these dispositions from an evolutionary point of view because you need them in order to be able to live together as communicating social beings.
So this is terrific news. I'm not only going to have to do experiments and learn statistics, I'm going to have to go sit in some godforsaken swamp and watch chimpanzees if I want to continue being a relevant philosopher.
No, you're not going to have to do it yourself, John.
No, you don't have to do it. And remember, you mentioned Hume and the one experiment in the treatise, but Hume wrote 5 volumes of a history of England, which he thought of as part of the same project. He thought that the historical exploration of people's moral habits was a way of thinking about moral philosophy, just as reflection in your armchair is, just as the experimental psychology is. And I think the trouble is, because almost anything that human beings do can be relevant to moral life, it's true that there aren't many limits to what we might have to think about. But I persist in thinking that the characteristic task and distinctive task of the philosopher in this area is to do so with the aim of trying to understand what the best way is to say what our moral obligations are. And that's something that these other people aren't doing.
Right. Anthony, on that note, I'm going to thank you for joining us. It's been a great conversation.
Well, thank you very much. It was great to be with you again.
Our guest has been Anthony Appiah, professor of philosophy from Princeton University, author most recently of a very fine book, which I'm about a third of the way through, Experiments in Ethics. So, John, what did you learn today?
Well, as often at the end of the program, I'm of two minds. One mind says, look, philosophy essentially involves sitting in an armchair. What's essential to philosophy are the methods I learned in graduate school. And anybody who says otherwise is making a category mistake. On the other hand, my own philosophical views are there are no essential properties. Anybody that tries to individuate a discipline by a set of methods they learned in graduate school is self-deceiving. And so I suppose that experimental philosophy makes a good deal of sense.
But here you can have your armchair as long as it's like a movable armchair. That is, you're not just contemplating your own navel, right? Sometimes it moves out to the savannah to watch the chimps as they scurry about. Sometimes you invite laboratory scientists into your drawing room to tell you about their latest results, and your philosophical speculation from the armchair is deeply informed by all the stuff everybody else is finding out about the world.
Yeah, no, I don't want to just sit in an armchair. I want to sit in an armchair and read Hume and Aristotle and Plato and maybe David Kaplan and Saul Kripke. And I definitely don't want to have to read anything with statistics in it.
Oh, well, your life is going to change. John, well, you're retiring soon from philosophy, so I don't know. But anyway, this conversation continues. I've got a blog that I'm working on. I started working on it this morning. It continues on our blog, theblog.philosophytalk.org, where our motto is always cogito ergo blogo. I think, therefore I blog.
For the final word, we're going to turn to that ongoing experiment in ethics, Ian Scholes, the 60-second philosopher.
Ian Scholes, experimental philosophy has generated a lot of controversy over the past 2 years via its newish concept of taking philosophical thought experiments, and instead of chewing on them privately in one's armchair, taking them to the street and seeing what Joe and Jane, not philosophers, have to say about them. For instance, experimental philosophers ask people to imagine a supercomputer in the future that knows everything. It knows that John Jones will rob a bank at a certain date and time. When John Jones does rob the bank at the date and time, is he still responsible, still an agent of free will? Most people said yes, which kind of throws the storyline of every Philip K. Dick novel into a cocked hat. Experimental philosophers have been criticized for turning thought experiments into opinion polls or an upscale version of Family Feud. As Joshua Knobe, one of the founders of experimental philosophy, acknowledged in the Dictionary of the Philosophy of Mind, quote, the use of naive subjects allows researchers to get access to intuitions that are not corrupted by theoretical preconceptions. On the other hand, it may be felt that naive subjects do not understand that their intuitions may therefore not be sensitive to the full array of relevant considerations, unquote. Well, I don't know. I do know that experimental philosophy offers T-shirts showing a picture of an armchair on fire. It has an anthem, which can be seen and heard on YouTube, and practitioners are fond of referring to experimental philosophy as X-Fi. Call me a naive subject, but I find this just irritating. I know it's an American habit to shorthand every damn thing, foodies and complit and pomo, but X-Fi, referencing a TV show that's been off the air for years, well, it doesn't really bestow the kind of hip gravitas that perhaps experimental philosophy might prefer. Don't get me wrong, I remain a big fan of the X-Files, which was chock full of aliens making people do things against their will. Come to think of it, when I was a kid, I used to have fantasies about me and the girl who sat in front of me in study hall being abducted by aliens and forced to French kiss against our will. I don't know what experimental philosophy would say about this fantasy from a volitional, intuitional, or free will standpoint, but from my point of view, I was definitely not responsible for my imaginary actions. At the very least, everybody would have to agree. Fantasizing about aliens who make you French kiss the person at the desk in front of you, well, it's as good a way as any to spend time in study hall. I gotta go.
Ian Scholes, the only man who can solve a philosophical problem in 60 seconds.
Philosophy Talk is a presentation of Ben Manila Productions and the trustees of Leland Stanford Junior University, copyright 2008.
Our executive producer is David Demarest.
Our production coordinator is Devin Strolovich. Daniel Elstein is our director of research. Lael Weiss is our webmaster. Also thanks to Zoe Corneli, Merle Kessler, Corey Goldman, and Mark Stone.
Philosophy Talk is sponsored in part by Powell's City of Books on the web at powells.com. Support also comes from the Templeton Foundation.
And from various groups at Stanford University, the Friends of Philosophy Talk, and the members of KALW San Francisco, where our program originates.
The views expressed or misexpressed in this program do not necessarily represent the opinions of Stanford University or of our other funders.
The conversation continues on our website, philosophytalk.org. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for thinking.